This is When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, where I look at the films that played some part in shaping the worldview of the young members of the MTV generation and turning us into the more or less mature adults we are today. This time, I'm looking at a heartwarming Christmas fable from 1985. Brazil. Brazil was directed by Terry Gilliam, who is well known, of course, as a member of the Monty Python comedy troupe. Prior to Brazil, Gilliam had directed the beloved cult classics Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Time Bandits, and would go on to direct The Fisher King and 12 Monkeys, amongst other films. Brazil was written by Gilliam along with famed playwright Tom Stoppard, known for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and Charles McCune, who will appear in the film as our protagonist's highly neurotic co-worker Lime. There are 3 different versions of Brazil. I'm looking at the European version, which is about 10 minutes longer, but not substantially different from the US release. There's also a version that's a good half-hour shorter. Brazil was released by MCA Universal, and the CEO at the time, Sidney J. Sheinberg, famously battled with Gilliam over the film. Sheinberg wanted to release the shorter version, which had an incongruously happy ending. Sheinberg's version, which has come to be known as the Love Conquers All cut, was never released theatrically, but it is included for the sake of novelty on the Criterion Collection DVD release. We open with a bucolic view of floating through clouds while we hear the lively strains of Aquaria do Brasil by Ari Barroso. We'll hear variations on the song several times throughout the film. This version is performed by folk musicians Jeff and Maria Moldauer. The title of the song gives us the most overt link to the title of the film. Brazil is not set in Brazil, nor is Brazil mentioned at any time. The title came about from Gilliam imagining a steelworker in a grim gray coastal town in Wales, sitting on a coal-blackened beach and listening to Latin music on the radio. The concept of Brazil represents a daydream of an impossible escape from grim and hopeless circumstances. A title card tells us we're somewhere in the 20th century, and for a film made in 1985, you could take that to mean Brazil is meant to take place in the very near future. However, Brazil is not a futuristic film per se. It's set in an unnamed city in a world that seems to be a jumble of the past, the present, and a pretty grim future. Wherever we are, it's the Christmas season. In a storefront window, a display of television sets shows a commercial for a new design of ducts from Central Services. The window suddenly explodes in a burst of fire and debris in what is presumably a terrorist attack. There will be several similar attacks throughout the film, and the Ministry of Information, the omnipresent and deeply scary, yet incompetent governing body that controls everything in the world of Brazil, consistently blames these attacks on terrorists. We'll never find out exactly who or what is behind these attacks, but it's worth bearing in mind that information provided by the Ministry of Information is not to be trusted. Throughout the film, they'll routinely label even mild nonconformists as terrorists. Over at the Ministry of Information, an office worker is compiling the extensive paperwork required for the upcoming arrest of one of these suspected terrorists, a man named Tuttle. The worker kills a fly, which falls into his printer and causes a typo on one of the forms, changing the name Tuttle to Buttle. We then go to the dismal Shangri-La Towers, where the Buttle family, their drab flat crisscrossed with ducks, prepares for Christmas. These ugly Central Services ducks appear in almost every interior location in Brazil. Like the Ministry of Information itself, they're omnipresent, they're inefficient, they make life more difficult, and most people have decided to deal with them by pretending they don't exist. Black-garbed armed commandos drill a hole through the ceiling and burst into the flat from all directions. They brutally arrest Mr. Buttle, and after a great deal of fussy paperwork, drag him off in chains. The Buttles' upstairs neighbor is a woman named Jill Layton, who peers through the new hole in her floor to see what's going on. Jill is played by Kim Griest, who is pretty much an unknown. She'd made her debut the previous year in Chud, that's Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers, obviously, and her only other screen credit for 1985 was an appearance on a not particularly memorable episode of Miami Vice. It's well documented that Terry Gilliam was unhappy with Griest's performance in the film and ended up cutting some of her scenes. Whatever went on behind the scenes, it's not apparent in the finished film. Griest is fine. Despite her inexperience, she does a solid job. In the Department of Information within the Ministry of Intelligence, a fussy and flighty supervisor named Mr. Kurtzman tries to make sense of the Buttle-Tuttle confusion. Kurtzman is played by film and theater legend Sir Ian Holm, who has had a long and distinguished career. Fantasy and sci-fi fans know him as the android Ash in Ridley Scott's Alien, and of course as Bilbo Baggins in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Kurtzman, who is in a perpetual nervous panic, searches for his best employee, Sam Lowry, who's late for work. Sam Lowry is asleep in his flat, lost in a magnificent dream in which he's some kind of mythical superhero clad in silver armor. Lowry's dreams and daydreams will recur throughout Brazil, and they're glorious. In Lowry's fantasy life, he's a winged warrior who battles supernatural creatures to rescue a beautiful blonde woman who looks exactly like Jill Layton. As Lowry proceeds through the plot of Brazil, his dreams will draw in more and more elements from his real world. He'll battle masked wraiths and a clingy rock creature who's clearly supposed to represent Mr. Kurtzman, and most spectacularly, a giant armored samurai. At one point, he defeats the samurai and rips off its mask to reveal his own face beneath, which is almost certainly not meant as an homage to a very similar scene in The Empire Strikes Back. Lowry's day-to-day existence is grim and tedious. As a minor cog in the great machine of the Ministry of Information, he's doing more harm than good. In his rich and detailed fantasy life, however, he's a brave warrior on a noble and heroic mission. These dream sequences are gorgeous and detailed, and they lend extra layers to what we see of Lowry's daily existence. Lowry is played by Welsh actor Jonathan Pryce, who is a noted stage star. He has also appeared in films like Evita and Pirates of the Caribbean, and he was the High Sparrow on Game of Thrones. Brazil is considered Pryce's breakthrough role, and deservedly so. He captures both sides of Sam Lowry, who's both the meek bureaucrat, hoping no one will notice him, and the brave warrior who rushes headlong into battle against an unstoppable foe. At the Ministry of Information, Lowry chats with his ruthless and ambitious friend Jack Lint, who works in security. Lint is played by Monty Python's Michael Palin, also known for A Fish Called Wanda and his many travel documentaries. Lint chastises Lowry for his lack of ambition, but Lowry is happy to bury himself in the low-profile world of records. While chatting with Lint, Lowry catches a glimpse of Jill Layton on a security camera and recognizes her as the woman of his dreams. Jill is trying to draw attention to the wrongful arrest of her neighbor Buttle, but has been given the runaround by multiple departments. Lowry learns from Kurtzman that his wealthy and well-connected mother Ida has snaked him an unwanted promotion from records to information retrieval. Irate, Lowry storms over to his mother's lavish apartment to yell at her for meddling. Ida, who is played by Soap and Who's the Boss star Katherine Helmond, is in the process of receiving a forcible and gruesome facelift from her doctor, played by Jim Broadbent, Oscar winner for Iris, who's appeared in a couple of Harry Potter films and was Archmaester Ebrose on Game of Thrones. Lowry accompanies his mother to an elegant restaurant where the posh dining room is crisscrossed with a tangle of visible ducts. They have lunch with Ida's plastic surgery-obsessed friend Mrs. Terrain, played by Barbara Hicks, and her socially maladroit daughter Shirley, played by Catherine Pogson. At the restaurant, they dine upon piles of monochromatic goop, which come accompanied by photos of duck à l'orange or whatever it's supposed to be. A violent terrorist attack causes much carnage and destruction, but after a brief pause, the chamber trio switches to a livelier tune and everyone resumes dining, speaking at a louder volume to drown out the sounds of human suffering. Back in his flat, Lowry wakes from his usual dream to find the room filled with smoke from a malfunctioning duct. He places an emergency call to Central Services, but is given the runaround. He sleeps with his head in his open refrigerator to keep cool. An armed man dressed in black raids his flat and introduces himself as a heating engineer named Harry Tuttle, the suspected terrorist who is supposed to be arrested instead of Buttle. Tuttle, who is played by Robert De Niro, isn't a terrorist at all. Instead, he's a renegade do-gooder working outside the system. He intercepted Lowry's emergency call, and he easily fixes Lowry's air conditioning. Tuttle's visit is interrupted by the arrival of the actual Central Services repairmen, Spoor and Dowser, who are played respectively by Who Framed Roger Rabbit's Bob Hoskins and Derek O'Connor. Tuttle is ready to kill them both to avoid discovery and arrest, but Lowry sends them away by pointing out that they don't have the correct paperwork. Comparisons are inevitably and aptly made between Brazil and George Orwell's 1984, but in place of 1984's willful and deliberate obliteration of the truth, much of the harm in the world of Brazil is done via the needless and confounding red tape that surrounds even the simplest of tasks. Kurtzman calls Lowry into his office in a panic because Records has been given a refund check for Mr. Buttle due to security overcharging him for his own interrogation. Mr. Buttle was accidentally killed during the interrogation, so Mr. Kurtzman has no idea what to do with the check and he's deathly afraid of taking responsibility for it. Lowry offers to deliver the check in person to Buttle's grieving widow. So Lowry drives a magnificently, ridiculously tiny car, which I have discovered is a real-life car that exists in our world. It's a Messerschmitt, and I now have a burning need to own one, to the Shangri-La Towers. He gives Mrs. Buttle the refund check for her husband's murder. While he's there, he catches another glimpse of Jill Layton. He tries to pull Jill's file at work to learn more about her, but it's classified. Lowry returns to his flat, which has been utterly destroyed by the vengeful Central Services repair dudes. He receives a singing telegram from his mom inviting him to a party to celebrate her successful plastic surgery. At the party, which is impossibly decadent and grotesque, Lowry tells the head of the Ministry of Information, Mr. Helpman, that he's decided to accept the promotion to information retrieval. Mr. Helpman is played by Peter Vaughn, who is Maester Aemon in Game of Thrones. Whole lot of Game of Thrones alumni in Brazil. At his high-powered new job in information retrieval, Lowry tries to find out more about Jill. His search leads him to security, where he chats with a very pleasant secretary while she types up a live transcript of an in-progress torture session taking place in the next room. Lowry visits the torturer, who turns out to be his old friend Lint. He asks Lint about Jill and discovers the ministry is looking to arrest her because she's been creating a great deal of fuss about Buttle's wrongful arrest and thus is probably a terrorist. Lowry spots Jill in the ministry lobby, where she's still demanding answers about Buttle. He saves her from arrest by flaunting his new authority and whisking her out of the building. Jill tries to escape in her ginormous truck, but Lowry hitches a ride, proclaims his love for her, and gradually wins her over. They're chased by armed commandos, so they hide in a department store which is rocked by explosions from another purported terrorist attack. While helping victims of the explosion, Lowry and Jill find themselves surrounded by commandos. Lowry imagines himself fighting the giant samurai from his dream. He tries to fight the commandos in real life and gets knocked out and arrested. Lowry returns to his job in disgrace with no idea of Jill's fate. He turns to Lint for help, but Lint tells him to keep his distance. Jill, who has evaded arrest, shows up at Lowry's flat. Ida is celebrating Christmas at her plastic surgeon's, so Lowry stashes Jill at Ida's while he returns to the ministry. He breaks into Mr. Heltman's office and tampers with records to proclaim Jill dead, thus ensuring the ministry will no longer chase her. He returns to Ida's place and finds Jill dressed in one of his mother's wigs and a long flowing nightgown, thus making her look exactly like his dream girl. They spend the night together. On Christmas morning, armed black-clad commandos burst into the bedroom and arrest them both. Lowry is taken to the ministry, where he learns Jill was killed while resisting arrest. Inside an immense chamber, he's tortured by Lint, who is wearing a grotesque baby mask like one worn by menacing creatures in his dreams. Harry Tuttle and his friends burst into the chamber, kill Lint, and smuggle Lowry out of the ministry. Lowry battles his enemies and, as a coup de grace, blows up the entire ministry building, which explodes into a flurry of paperwork which rains down over the city like snow. Lowry flees into a church, where he finds a funeral in progress for Ida's friend Mrs. Terrain, presided over by a priest played by Roger Ashton Griffiths, Mace Tyrell in Game of Thrones. He encounters Ida, who's had enough plastic surgery to make her the spitting image of Jill. When the commandos burst in to arrest Lowry, Lowry knocks over Mrs. Terrain's casket, revealing that she is dissolved into a pile of bones and goo from too much plastic surgery. He jumps into the casket and magically winds up in Jill's truck. Lowry and Jill speed away from the city into the idyllic green countryside, where they settle down and live happily ever after. And it ends with Lint and Mr. Heltman in the torture chamber, looking down at a lobotomized Lowry who is humming to himself, locked forever in his fantasy world. I feel like my rundown of the story was pretty detailed, yet not nearly detailed enough. Brazil is a very complex and multi-layered film with constant callbacks to things that happened earlier, big and small, and recurring themes. Brazil received Oscar nominations for Best Original Screenplay and for Norman Garwood and Maggie Gray's production design. Both well-deserved. Gilliam described the look of the film as Frank Capra meets Franz Kafka, which seems pretty bang on. There's a lot of beautiful old contraptions from the first half of the 20th century, like pneumatic tubes, and the computers have old-school manual typewriter keyboards. It's all combined with a lot of forbidding gray Eastern Bloc architecture, plus a lot of junky contraptions and piles of old clutter. It's a brilliant film just to watch for the set design. There's so much interesting stuff to spot in every frame. Monty Python's Flying Circus aired in syndication on US television throughout the 80s, most notably on MTV, and Monty Python were beloved by Gen X teens. It's pretty common at my junior high and high school to be able to quote great sections of Holy Grail from memory. Brazil, thanks to Terry Gilliam and Michael Palin, is Monty Python adjacent, and thus it had a great deal of interest amongst Gen X teens upon its release. To tie this all back to the overarching theme of this series, here's what Gen X learned from watching Brazil. We learned that grim dystopias are best handled with a darkly morbid and sardonic sense of humor. And from where I'm filming this today, in the grim and scary time of May of 2020, with no real idea of what the coming months will bring for all of us, that dark sense of humor is coming in pretty handy. It's not that Gen X doesn't take things seriously. We do, but when we find ourselves in the face of bad things, we resort to dark humor and sarcasm. And that's a trait we learned in part from films like Brazil. Brazil is a very dark film. Lowry rebels against a brutal system in the name of love, and it all comes to naught. The woman he loves is killed, and the closest Lowry gets to a happy ending is the illusion of peace that comes from a non-consensual frontal lobotomy. But it's also an incredibly funny film with sharp, witty dialogue and non-stop sight gags. Watching it is a deeply satisfying yet profoundly unsettling experience. Brazil is a complex masterpiece, so I feel it's only fair to follow it up with some simple trash, so what the heck. Next time I'm going to tackle the greatest trash masterpiece of the 1980s, Tough Turf. Just warning you now, I have an awful lot to say about that one, so I hope you'll join me for that. Thank you for hanging in there with me, and I hope to see you here later.